Good morning. On behalf of Family Research Council, welcome to this lecture in our series of family policy lectures, today featuring a very distinguished guest, Joy Brighton, who will be discussing Sharia law. My name is Rob Schwarzwalder. I have the privilege of serving as Senior Vice President at Family Research Council, and we're very glad that you've taken time out of your schedule to hear about such a compelling issue. Let me make a couple of comments as housekeeping items before we begin. First, for those of you who are here in the audience, we do wish to mention, and we don't anticipate this, but for the record, we do have security. If there are any disruptions, you'll be escorted out. We, again, don't anticipate that, but given the seriousness of the topic, we have provided extra security for that reason. Second, for those of you here, we also invite you to join us for a wonderful lunch afterward. One of the purposes of our lectures is not only to hear a distinguished speaker, but to provide opinion leaders like yourselves the opportunity to interact with Ms. Brighton and people like her, to get to know one another and foster communities of interest and conviction so that together we can work more effectively. For those of you who will be viewing online in future days, we appreciate your interest in this compelling issue, one of great importance to not only American families, but to the very security of our country, and we're appreciative of your joining us. Recently, a gentleman who goes by the name of Mufti Muhammad Taqi Usmani made this statement, and I'm quoting, "For a non-Muslim state to have more pomp and glory than a Muslim state itself is an obstacle. Therefore, to shatter this grandeur is among the greater objectives of jihad." In other words, attacks against a country of the United States are actually a pretty good idea. Now, we could dismiss that as the statement of yet another radical Islamic cleric. However, this fellow is on the board of, and I think I have the name right, the Accounting and Auditing Organization for Islamic Financial Institutions, Standardized Islamic Financial Products Board. In other words, he is having a direct impact on Sharia law and financial institutions, and in turn, financial institutions are taking seriously the strictures of Islamic law. It's because of the threat that Islamic law's Sharia provisions impose upon our financial system that we've invited our distinguished guest today. Joy Brighton is a former Wall Street trader who is today part of an international team of experts concerned about the non-transparent risks of the Sharia Islamic finance investment market. Ms. Brighton is a graduate of Columbia Business School and was a fixed-income salesperson trader for Lehman Brothers, a mortgage pipeline hedge trader for Chase Home Securities, and an adjunct professor of securities and investments at various colleges. Later a graduate of Fordham University with a graduate degree in counseling, Joy worked as an executive coach catering to investment professionals. In 2008, given her growing involvement in and awareness of the threat Sharia financial codes impose upon our own economic system, she created the www.stopsharianow.org website, which is now a project of Act for America. Today, Joy is brought in as an Islamic banking specialist to speak with Congress and other groups concerned about national security and the preservation of capital markets, free capital markets. She's also put her life where her mouth is, so to speak, by actively engaging in microfinance for women in the developing world, something that many of us have a keen interest in, so that women in developing countries actually have a chance to advance and live productive and happy lives. It's a great pleasure and a distinct honor for me then to ask you to join me in welcoming our guest, Ms. Joy Brighton.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining me. I was hoping we were going to see some cherry blossoms today. I'm not from this area, and I guess I'm a little early. I'll have to come back. For those of you who are listening on the webcast, this is really a message for you, for American families across this nation, and I'll hope you'll stay tuned. Let's start. Here's what America looks like today. We have our sons and daughters going over to Afghanistan and Iraq to fight the Taliban in harm's way. We have our government imposing sanctions on Iran for developing nuclear warheads. And we have our U.S. intelligence agents doing everything they can to stop terrorism at home. So we're all in this together, right? I mean, it's one country under God. Not exactly. The banks are on the other side. As we go through this program, I want you to take a deep breath. Some of this may be shocking and hard to believe. But what you need to know is that as you go out and speak about this, we're starting to see interest and concern at the local level, the state level, and folks like me are working at the federal level. So it's having an impact. I'm going to rewind a little bit and tell you how I got here. Started my career at Lehman Brothers, 4 phones, 4 computers, 4-letter words. I lived through September 11th. I could see the smoke coming uptown from my window. I ran downstairs, and with my neighbor, we ran to her school, her children's school, to pick up her children. And outside the street, the principal was having a conversation with all these parents saying, please don't take your children out of school, because what are we going to do when at the end of the day, we have children here whose parents will never show up, because so many of our children's parents work at the Trade Center. I started getting very concerned about what was happening in this country. And I made a new friend, Dr. Rachel Ehrenfeld, who's a terror financing expert. She had recently written a book called Funding Evil, which talked about how Islamic extremism is being funded. We had a tuna fish sandwich. And I learned a new word that day. I learned the word Sharia. When you think Sharia, think radical Islam. Sharia is the written doctrine of radical Islam. When you think radical Islam, we all think of Iran. They're all tied together. Shortly thereafterwards, I got an invitation to go to a Sharia finance conference in downtown Manhattan. And I said, what could that be about? So I went. And the whole day I learned about that this market is very simple. It's about a benign, harmless way for Muslims to invest, that they don't believe in investing in pork or alcohol or tobacco or gambling, and that their investments can't be associated with interest. But more important, I learned that there was an awful lot of money to be made in this market, that at $77 a barrel of oil today, we're talking about anywhere from $750 billion to $1 trillion a year of oil wealth wanting to be invested in this country. At the end of the day, I raised my hand and I said, I understand investments, but I'm confused about the connection between investments and Sharia. And the whole room went silent. And the moderator, who was a partner at Gerson Savage, turned to a sheikh, Sheikh Yakbi. And he said, I think the sheikh should answer this question. And the sheikh sat there, just as you see him. And he said, Sharia is the path on which we walk and the water which we drink. And there were no follow-up questions, not one. And the moderator said, let's move on. And I said, huh? That's not what Rachel told me. And at that point, I knew that only half the story was being told. And since then, I've connected with experts in this country as well as in England and throughout Europe, focusing on what is going on with Sharia banking and Sharia at large. Okay, so we can't talk about Sharia finance until we really understand what Sharia is and where it lives in the world. So here's the world in which you and I live in, the global world. And here's the world in which peaceful, moderate Muslims live, the Islamic world. Here's another world. This is the world in which Sharia extremists live. We can politely call them Sharia faithful. And here's another world, the world that we're going to focus on today, Sharia respectful community. These are businesses and organizations that are engaging with Sharia because they think it's the right thing to do, because they think that Sharia is a religion, or that maybe there's a lot of money to be made, or maybe it's just politically correct to engage. Let's go deeper. Who's actually in that red fireball? The Iranian government rules 100% by Sharia law. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda rule 100% by Sharia law. Hamas and Hezbollah, 100% by Sharia law. And the Saudi government Sharia law. In fact, there are terror organizations in over 70 countries today that rule by Sharia law. Who's on the other side? Well, when there was a fraud in Iran about the vote, we had people protesting in the street, Iranian Muslims protesting in the street. They're on the other side. There are women's rights activists, Muslim women's rights activists, demanding or hoping, urging that they get the right to marry who they want to, protect their children, drive. And there are freedom fighters all over this country fighting to stop creeping Sharia in their countries. All these countries here, Turkey, Pakistan, India, Nigeria, you wonder why Muslims are killing Muslims? Well, it's the Sharia faithful Muslims that are killing those Muslims who don't want to live under their rule. Let's go a little deeper. What is the difference between our law and their law? Sharia law is totalitarian. We're democratic. Sharia law is global. It's about taking over the entire world. U.S. law is national within our borders. Mosque and state are one. It's a theocracy. Church and state are separate in our country. There's legal inequality. And what I mean by that is that legally, women are less equal than men, and non-Muslims are less equal than Muslims. In our country, it's all about legal equality. And there is no freedom of speech, religion, assembly, or press under Sharia law. And we saw that. Again, when those Iranian students were protesting, did you notice a media blackout, a Google blackout? Nothing came across. In this country, we were founded on the First Amendment. Let's go deeper into human rights. And as you think about this, I want you to say to yourself, is it possible for a product or a service to comply with Sharia law and U.S. law at the same time? Because the answer is no, it is not possible. So, non-Muslims under Sharia law either have to pay a tax or they're killed. Those who convert away from Islam, known as apostates, receive a death sentence and are persecuted. Freedom of religion is what we stand for in this country. Male supremacy, it's not just dominance of men. Women are the property of men according to Sharia law. We believe in equal rights. Honor killing is condoned under Sharia law, where murder of any kind is a criminal offense in this country. It is common for children to be married as young as 5, 6, 7, and 8-year-olds to men who are 60, 70, and 80 under Sharia law. In America, we believe in protecting our children. Polygamy is legal. 1 man, 4 wives. Here, it's illegal. Very important. It's the obligation of every Muslim under Sharia law to take the law into their own hands and to enforce all these principles. In this country, taking the law into your own hands will put you in jail. And this is something interesting. It's not exactly human rights, but it's our value system that's different. There's a concept known as taqiyya under Sharia law, which says that it's okay for Muslims who believe in Sharia law to lie and deceive non-Muslims if it's in the interest of promoting Islam, where you and I believe in being truthful. And that's a very important value, and we teach our children this. The political goal of Sharia extremists is to rule the world. It is a political movement. It is not a religion. And the way they do this is through jihad. This kind of jihad, violent jihad, is something that you're probably familiar with. We're talking about September 11th, 3,000 Americans murdered. We're talking about Mumbai. But here's a kind of violent jihad that you may not know about that's growing every single day. We are seeing young men, young teens, young children being indoctrinated in mosques and over the internet, finding their way to Yemen and Pakistan and Somalia, engaging with Al-Qaeda, and becoming violent jihadists. The fellow in the middle was raised in California, Orange County. He was radicalized in his own hometown in his mosque. He went over to Somalia. He is now the spokesman for Al-Qaeda. He made a statement 2 days ago that said that Major Hassan, the Muslim who executed or killed 13 soldiers on the Fort Hood Army base, was a role model, a trailblazer, and someone who we need to follow. 1 in every 3 African Americans in our prison system are being converted to radical Islam, a report that recently came out by our government. The religionofpeace.com is an organization that tracks how many deadly terrorist attacks have been happening since 9/11, and they say there's been almost 15,000 deadly Islamic terror attacks. Is everybody still with me? Are you taking a deep breath? Okay, here's something different. Cultural jihad that you may not be familiar with. It's just as deadly as violent, but it's quiet, and it's hard to detect. Here's an example. 20-year-old Noor, living in Arizona, decides to wear makeup, as you can see, and dress like a Western girl, raises a Muslim. Her father runs her over in the family Jeep again and again, and a week later she dies in the hospital. A terrible story. What's worse, or what's equally terrible, is that the defender, the public defender for the father, went to the judge and said, "We ask that you not seek the death penalty," which is the norm in Arizona, because we're very concerned that it's going to look like a Christian judge is going to execute a Muslim. And we've been learning a lot about Sharia law, and this is kind of a cultural thing. They don't really view it as murder. And so it's been decided that Arizona will not seek the death penalty for the father. So what are we seeing? Sharia law is becoming supreme to our own law. This is a very dangerous precedent. Another example, 17-year-old Rivka from Ohio, born a Muslim, decides at 17 she wants to convert to Christianity. Her father finds out and threatens to kill her as an honor killing. She gets on the internet, finds a Christian family in Florida, gets on a bus. 26 hours later, she's in Florida with that family. It goes to the court system in Florida. The court system in Florida decides that by listening to her parents' lawyers, that this is a cultural issue, that she's just a belligerent teenager, this threat isn't real, and she gets sent back to Ohio. She is in a foster care family, but she gets sent back to Ohio. But remember what I said about vigilante justice. It is the obligation of every Muslim to carry out that. And Ohio, that community from which she's from, is a very extremist group. And so what are we seeing again? A dangerous precedent. What happened to children's rights? What happened to freedom of religion? There's a YouTube video of her crying, saying, "What happened to freedom of religion in America?" Here's another example. In August of 2008, Sherry Jones writes a novel called The Jewel of Medina, where she talks about Muhammad taking a child bride at age 6, which is true. Random House, the largest publisher in the world, starts getting phone calls that they might expect some violence, that some Muslims are offended. And Random House stops the presses, stops the book tour, and throws our First Amendment right out the window. The beginning of the weakening of free press in our country. And this is not the only example. There are several dozen instances like this in which books have been burned, inventories have been pulled back, and authors engaged in costly lawsuits trying to fight to get their book out there. And so now we come to Sharia financial jihad. Because think about it. How do you make friends and influence people? You buy them off. You give them a little money. It's a lot easier than flying planes into towers. It's a lot cleaner. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So as I talk today, I want you to think about some things. I want you to think about, are the banks that are engaged in this, are they doing their research? Are they kicking the tires? Are they being clear in what they're doing? Are they disclosing all the facts? Because if they're not disclosing the facts, then they're violating civil law. These are civil violations of U.S. securities law. And are banks doing everything that they can to make sure that their banks are not funding terror through the cash flows that go in and out of that bank? Because if not, they're in danger of criminal violations, or they're engaging in criminal violations. So think about this as we go through. So how does Sharia Islamic law, we just talked about, how does it fit with Sharia finance? It's a 4-letter word. It's called Iran. Iran was the first entrant in Sharia banking. In 1978, the whole world changed. In 1978, the Shah was deposed. Ayatollah Khomeini came in, along with Ahmadinejad. Together, they threw out everything secular. No human rights, no women's rights, no higher education for women. Secular law went out the window. Sharia law came in with the mullahs enforcing this all over the country, including their banking system. They created Sharia banking. So this means that prior to 1978, all over the world, including the Middle East, there was essentially Western banking until 1978, when Iran came along. Today, Iran has 32% of assets under management under Sharia are located in Iranian banks. They are the market leader of Sharia banking. They're also the market leader in terror financing. You can look at the top 10 banks. They've been implicated by our own U.S. government as funding terror. So Sharia banking is Iranian banking. It is one and the same. Let's look how quickly this market's been growing. You can see between 2001 and 2008, it's grown quite quickly, 10% to 15% a year. We now have about $1 trillion of Sharia investments being managed the Sharia way. But there's something interesting about this chart. Why is it starting in 2001? We just got finished saying that Iran started this market in 1978. The reason for that is between 1978 and almost the year 2000, Sharia banking only existed in Iran and in Sudan. No other country or government in the Middle East was willing to take on Sharia banking because even they don't want their mullahs and their imams messing with their money. They understand what Sharia is. It wasn't until Western banks went in, Citibank went in 1996, unofficially in 81, to start this market. They went over there and they were told, you know, we have a religious obligation to invest a certain way, and we have all this money to invest. Please help us. So if it weren't for Western banks like HSBC, Citibank, Barclays, and others, we would not have Sharia banking today. Again, it's all about money. So what do banks are actually doing? What is Goldman Sachs actually doing when they're creating Sharia investments? The first thing they have to do is, just like in Iran, they have to hire Sharia scholars to sit on advisory boards at the bank. Here's just one. And here's Sheikh Taqi Usmani, kind of a handsome fellow. And the senior vice president who introduced me actually read a quote from Taqi Usmani. Taqi Usmani sits, as he said, on this global oversight board called the AAOIFI. It's a mouthful. He's the chairman of this, as a matter of fact. This is the group that sets the standards for this market. Alongside of him sit member banks of Iran and Sudan. He sits on these boards and others: Citibank, Dow Jones, HSBC, and Guidance Financial. He was a clerk to the Taliban in 2001. In 2006, he wrote a book where one chapter talked exclusively about the importance of violent jihad. And you heard a quote from that chapter. And he has a family madrasa, the second largest madrasa in Pakistan, with Deobandi ties, which means very, very radical, which boasts close ties to the Taliban. Here's another Sharia scholar. And, you know, I want to say something about scholars. You know, when we think about scholars, we think about somebody being in the library, right? Writing books and theses and equations. That's what we think about when we think about a scholar. But that is not the definition of a scholar under Sharia law. Osama bin Laden takes his orders from a Sharia scholar. These are folks that are at the top of the Sharia totem pole. And when they say something, all the soldiers act. Kawadari. He's the former chairman of that global oversight board. He sits on dozens of boards in the Middle East. He's also a terrorist banned from the United States and the United Kingdom, which is the reason why he doesn't sit on American boards and England boards. Here's how he describes the importance of charity, and we're going to learn how charity fits into all this. He calls charity jihad with money, because God has ordered us to fight our enemies with our lives and with our money. So I want you to understand that these are the kind of scholars that sit on the global board and they sit on the local boards. Do you see what's happening here? Okay, so who are the banks that are actually engaged in what I'm going to call Iranian banking? Well, Goldman and Citibank, with a little help from our taxpayer bailout dollars, are involved in this market. Visa, the proud sponsor of the 2010 Olympics, offers Visa Sharia credit cards, along with every other bank that you see here. Look at this, JP Morgan Chase, American Express. Everybody's getting in the game because there's money to be made, or they're being told there's money to be made. Who's missing from this? Generally, who's missing are community banks, and regional banks are generally not involved in this. They're protecting America. They're not in it for just the bucks. Something to think about when you think about where you're investing. What other firms are engaged? AIG took taxpayer bailout money over a year ago, turned around the next month and said that they were going to offer Sharia insurance to customers, and we're going to learn more about that. GE brings good things to light. Not lately. They just issued an Islamic bond. And all these other firms are engaged in Sharia finance, Sharia banking, Iranian banking. What about the law firms? We all know we can't have a business without the lawyers, right? Well, here they are. The largest law firms in the world are becoming specialists in this. Okay, we talked about AIG. They got taxpayer bailout money in November of 2008. In December of 2008, they made this announcement. It's a press release saying that they were proud to offer a series of Sharia-compliant takaful, the Arabic word for insurance, product offerings. And how do they describe them? Socially responsible solutions. Blackstone, probably the largest property finance company in the world, one of them, has its own division called the Blackstone Sharia Finance Division. And their tagline is property finance the ethical way. And UBS, just to give you a sense that this is, everyone's describing it this way, talks about the ethical principles, and there you see UBS Islamic Finance. So what is so ethical or socially acceptable about charity? Oops, what is ethical or socially acceptable about Sharia or Sharia finance? Which brings us to step 2. Sharia investments have to send money directly to charity, and that's what makes them ethical and socially responsible. Because, you know, as Americans, we believe in giving to charity. We believe in giving, helping the needy, feeding the hungry. And the folks who believe in Sharia law believe in that also, but they take it a little bit further than that. Here's a snapshot of the Amana Mutual Funds Trust. Amana is the Sharia division of HSBC, and it is enormous. Here you can see they do talk about zakat. They call it zakah. Okay, so we know what's happening. Charity is being given away. They have 8 categories that they put right up there. Those whose hearts are being reconciled, I'm not actually sure what that is. That's people being converted to Islam, by the way. And the last category, in the cause of God, which is kind of a catch-all. And they describe it quite well in their last paragraph. And they say that any program or organization that promotes Islam is entitled to receive zakat. They say specifically mosques and Islamic education centers. And let me tell you something. 75% of the mosques in this country are Saudi-funded. And they are radical. They are Wahhabi. And if you ask a moderate Muslim, and I work with many of them, they say that they have a hard time finding a mosque that's peaceful these days. So zakat, charity, goes to mosques, and it also goes to organizations like CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations. I don't know if you know about this. It's a Muslim political lobby. They fund a lot of the lawsuits that we're going to talk about today. The FBI recently cut ties to CARE because there's some evidence that they're funding Hamas. They call charity of this kind dawah, promoting Islam, inviting the world to join them. Let's go to GE. In November 2009, GE issued a $500 million Islamic bond with the help of Goldman Sachs and Citibank and your tax dollars. Here's some information from the prospectus that someone sent to me from London. You can see that Sharia is mentioned on all those pages. So the answer is yes. Sharia, the word Sharia is in all the documents. And you can see that yes, in the prospectus, it absolutely says that money will be segregated and paid to charity. So yes, GE knows this, and so does Citi and Goldman. And if you look at the last box, what kind of charity? Any other Sharia-compliant charity. And who decides what charity that is? The Sharia scholars that sit on the boards. One more thing. You might ask, well, why did someone have to send it to me from London? I mean, why didn't I just pick it up at a Goldman office or a Citi office? This bond was specifically issued overseas. You might say, or you might guess, that maybe it's because when you issue a bond overseas to non-American investors, you don't have to register it with the SEC. And therefore, this prospectus is not public in this country, and it's very hard to get a copy of it. That is not to say that American investors are not buying this bond, because if Can you hear me? Because if you have a bank with branches overseas, you can still buy that bond, and you may have American investors investing with you. Okay, so how is it possible that an investment or a bond gives money to charity? I mean, think about it. In our country, or Western banking capitalism, you buy a Procter & Gamble bond, you get some interest back, you decide, I want to take some of my money and write a check to Family Research Council. Not so under Sharia. It's all in one. It's a one-step process. You can't extract it. This is an example of a Sharia bond. I know it's a little crazy looking. Don't worry about that. That's because under Sharia law, there's no interest allowed. So there's a little bit of financial tweaking that goes along, and interest gets converted to other things like rent or lease. It's called a derivative. Bingo, remember that word? That's the word that causes subprime mortgage collapse. But anyway, you see at the top there's a bucket collecting charity. So when you buy, or when someone buys, and it's not just Muslims buying this, let me be clear about this. Okay, this is a global market. Buy this bond. Money is automatically going to charity. You can't extract it. But the definition of charity goes even deeper than just to mosques and Islamic centers and to dawah. Here's a book called The Reliance of the Traveler. It's the authoritative rulebook on Sharia law. It's got all the rules and principles, and it's agreed upon by the most prestigious Sharia scholars in the world. And on page 272, you can see that it says the seventh category of zakat, and you can read it. Those fighting for Allah, meaning people engaged in Islamic military operations for whom no salary has been allotted in the army. In other words, the feeding and clothing of jihadis. Lots of things are written in books, right? I mean, how can we really be certain that this is happening? Because 27 Sharia Islamic charities in this country have been designated as sponsors of terror or shut down by our own U.S. government. And if you look at some of the names in red, they don't exactly sound like bad things or bad charities. Benevolence Foundation, Care International, not to be confused with CARE, although they'd like you to be confused with it. Kind Hearts, the Saudi Red Crescent, and the World Assembly of Muslim Youth. These charities have been shut down for funding violent jihad. Violent jihad. Okay, let's take HSBC again, who's very, very deeply involved, and I know there's branches all over the country of HSBC, and I want you to remember that just because your money isn't being invested in these investments, when you're banking and putting deposit money in these banks are then going out and building Sharia finance divisions all over the world. So you're basically lending them money so they can do things like this. HSBC is excitedly giving a check, a charity check, to charity. In this case, it's going to an endowment fund at an Islamic university in Malaysia. So now we know that charity from HSBC and others can actually go overseas to some of these universities. And this is a snapshot of the website of this endowment fund. And on the website, it says what do they do with the zakat that they receive? Well, according to the way of God, but it's used for jihad. There you have it. And this is very upsetting, and this is very recent. Recently, MasterCard joined up with the Palm Desert National Bank in California, and I believe they're in Arizona also, and they offered a Sharia Pay debit card. And what they say is that they're going to send 22% of their net revenues to charity. Because when you have a credit card, the company's making money on interest from you. But because they can't accept interest, that interest is being diverted and going to charity and some in the pockets of the bank. Someone did some research and looked at Islamic charities all over this country that have not been designated funders of terror, but are absolutely linked. And you can see the mosques in this country, and this is not a complete list, and the Islamic academies who have links with extremist organizations. With this credit card, you can designate any charity you want. And here are some of them. So how much money are we talking about? I mean, is it a lot? Is it a little? Well, one Sharia mutual fund said that they were giving about 9% of their profits to charities. So let's take a look at 2009. In 2009, the Dow Jones was up 19%. It was a good year. And so if we say that at 19%, and we know that there's $1 trillion of Islamic investments or Sharia investments around the world, $1 trillion at 19% return on investment, $190 billion of profits. 9% of $190 billion, about $17 billion. This is a conservative number. Likely went to zakat in 2009. And wouldn't it be great if the Family Research Council got a check for $17 billion? But that didn't happen. Yeah, some of this money went to feed the hungry. And much of it went to mosques, many of them radical. And some of it went to fund violent jihad. Which brings us to step 3, the third step that a bank has to do in order to offer a Sharia investment, a bond or a mutual fund. They can only invest, and let's think about a mutual fund. Mutual funds under Sharia law can only invest in certain industries. Remember, we're talking about Iran. So think about the Iranian economy, which is a Sharia economy. What do they invest in? What don't they invest in? They don't invest in alcohol, pork, gambling, tobacco, and pornography, which is why these investments are being called ethical. But they also don't invest in Western defense. There's no construction of churches or any other non-Islamic house of worship. There's no publication of Bibles or any other non-Islamic religious text. And there's no Western books, TV, radio, or film. What does Iran have a lot of and invest in? Oil. And research shows that Sharia mutual funds are more invested in oil than Western mutual funds. Okay, so how can we be sure that all these banks are really doing step 1, step 2, step 3, are really engaging in Iranian Sharia banking? Because every investment that walks out the door has to have a certificate of compliance that says that this particular bank, in this case Citi Islamic Bank, which is the Sharia banking division of Citibank, and it is huge, has to have a certificate that says we have complied, and there you can see, we have complied with Sharia rules and principles. Complied with Sharia rules and principles 4 times. Nowhere does it say what those rules and principles are. And who's it signed by? It's signed by 3 Sharia scholars. One of them is Sheikh Yaqbi, the fellow who talked about the path and the water. Again, every single bank that's offering this has a certificate of compliance, Sharia compliance. Ask yourself, if it's compliant with Sharia, is it also compliant with U.S. law? Here you have AIG. Inaya is also their division. It's signed by Sheikh Yaqbi, same fellow with the path in the water, and oh look, it's signed by Usmani. This is a different Usmani. This is Usmani's son, Taki Usmani's son. They keep it all in the family. You can begin to see how a few people are controlling this market. And I want you to tell you something else. This is a market in Arabic. In Arabic. All the products there's Arabic names for them, which means that our bankers are talking about Arabic, but they don't really understand Arabic. So they're hiring people who do. So you have Goldman Sachs and Citibank engaged in this market not understanding the language, relying on people who do understand the language. Okay, so how is it that all these banks are getting it wrong? I mean, how is that possible, that all these banks, and how could their lawyers allow them to be saying things like it's ethical? Why aren't they disclosing these charities? How are they, where did they learn this from? Well, a lot of them learned it from Harvard. Harvard has the largest Islamic studies department in the country, funded by Saudi dollars. And they just had their 8th annual Sharia Islamic Finance Conference last spring. One of my colleagues was there. I can tell you that there was no mention of jihad, of charity, of human rights abuse, nothing. There was a lot of mention about no alcohol, no pork, no tobacco. So when our U.S. Treasury said, you know what, this is a new market we need to look into, who did they turn to learn about this market? They went to Harvard and learned the same thing that everybody else learned. No interest, no alcohol, no tobacco, ethical. What is the goal of Sharia banking? The goal of Sharia banking is to replace Western capitalism with Sharia finance. Okay, this is important to know that it's being sold to banks and insurance companies as a good way to diversify your portfolio. That, you know what, capitalism has it all wrong. Look what happened to them in 2008. They were a disaster. Sharia finance is ethical. It's the way to go. We give to charity. It's for everyone, everywhere. And it's important that you know that non-Muslims are being targeted for this. Again, this is why. This is how they can call it ethical investing. And they say it's less risky because there's a lot of oversight. And there is. Those Sharia scholars are right on top of it. So pension funds, fund managers, and insurance companies are looking at this product as a way to diversify this product. Nobody's checking the facts. This market was down 4 times further. It fell 4 times further than our market in 2008. But nobody's checking those facts. Okay, so let's back up. Here we are, Sharia Islam, a political movement that wants to engage the whole world in Sharia law through finance, through cultural jihad, and violent jihad. And here's how fast it's growing. Political Sharia is growing with the help of the folks who are respectful of Sharia, of banks, law firms, universities, and more. Let's dig down real quick into Minnesota and see what's happening there. There's a taxpayer-funded Islamic charter school, one of about 13 across the country, that are being investigated for hate speech and other issues. Taxi drivers are refusing to carry passengers, Muslim taxi drivers, who have seeing eye dogs or carrying alcohol or beer. Dogs are un-Islamic. There are footbaths at the Minneapolis airport, and this is not the only airport, by the way. Taxpayer funded. The Minnesota Housing Agency, as of a year ago, is now offering Sharia mortgages. And Golden Plump, a meat packer, recently settled a religious discrimination lawsuit by 9 Muslims who demanded to get off the factory line, pray 5 times a day, not handle pork, and the case was settled. Tyson Foods settled a similar case. In fact, meatpackers all over the country are dealing with this issue. Tyson Foods decided to offer a choice to Muslim employees. They can take Labor Day off as a paid holiday, or they can choose the Muslim holiday of their choice. And there's very few Muslims. They're not the majority of people working on those factory lines. They're 10%, 15%. The bottom line, what's happening in Minnesota, there have been 20 homegrown terrorists who have made their way, indoctrinated in mosques in their hometowns in Minnesota, and gone off to engage in violent jihad. And the first American suicide bomber came from his hometown in Minnesota. He went overseas and he blew himself up in Somalia and tried to kill as many non-Muslims as he could. What about moderate Muslims? Are they saying anything? There are a few who are saying things. This is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He's the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Here's what he says. Make no mistake. Sharia-compliant finance is neither about religion nor about God. Its real long-term vision is to impose Sharia law on the world and recreate an Islamic empire. Bankers and business leaders are being duped, but nobody's listening to him. Here's what my Wall Street buddies are saying when I talk to them privately at cocktail parties. They say, Joy, make it illegal and I'll stop doing it. They say, you know, if I don't do the deal, somebody else will. And they say, Joy, it's just about business. And you know what? It may be just about business for them, but it's about my children and your children and our families and our grandchildren. Oops. Okay, and what is the media saying about this? Not much. And that is where you come in. We need you to sound the alarm. It's only with your voices at the local level that will trickle up to the state level and the federal level to learn about this. You need to talk to everyone you know. Church groups, cocktail parties, tea parties, anywhere you go. Talk to your bank. Is your bank engaged in Sharia banking? If it is, you have a choice to make. This is changing so rapidly that what I encourage you to do is go to Google, put your bank's name in it, put Islamic finance rather than Sharia finance next to it, and you'll quickly find out if your bank's engaged in it. Join action groups like Act for America, which is a grassroots network focusing on Islamic extremism in this country. The Family Research Council, Let Freedom Ring. There's more and more groups like this that are becoming very concerned with what's happening in our country. And you know, you don't need to know all the facts. I know I've told you a lot today. You don't need to know all this. All you need to know is that Sharia law is the law of Iran and the Taliban. And Sharia banking was started by Iran, and it's Iranian banking. And that's enough. Because if this was called apartheid banking, wouldn't we be saying, wait a minute? Wouldn't the banks be saying, wait a minute? Or what if this was Nazi finance? They're calling it Sharia finance, and nobody's listening. So you can go to www.stopsharianow.org. There's more facts than you need to know what to do with, and there's videos. But again, you don't need to be the expert here. So is everybody still with me? Breathe. Okay, we're going to take some questions now.
Peter Sprague with Family Research Council. There we go. I just want to ask a basic question. Forgive my ignorance, but I mean, I guess I sort of understand how they might be able to make money in the stock market and so forth. But the way an ordinary bank works is they attract depositors by paying them interest. Then they loan that money out and collect interest from the borrower. So how can they make money without interest? How can a bank make money without interest?
Okay.
Can you explain that basic question?
Okay. Well, first, let me just say, there's interest. Okay, that's ridiculous. They just say, it's like the difference between, you know, taking out a car loan or leasing a car. In one case, you're making a lease payment. In the other case, you're making an interest payment. It's all semantics. That's all it is. But let me explain to you, it's not really deposits that's driving this market. When I talked about the GE bond, okay, what likely happened with that issue and what's been happening is that who's driving this market? Saudi Arabia, the Emirates. By the way, Dubai is the #1 trader of goods and services with Iran. They're going to GE and saying, you know what? We used to buy investments any which way, your way. And they still do. They buy buildings, they buy real estate, they buy banks, they buy all kinds of things. But now they're saying, we want to buy investments the Sharia way. And what they say is, we have $250 million to invest. Why don't you go find another $250 million worth of investors and come up with an Islamic bond deal for us? We'll buy half of it, you sell the other half to the other 250 million investors, dollar investors, and you'll make money. So there's money to be made. This is how Wall Street makes money. Wall Street makes money by issuing bonds and mutual funds. There's origination fees, there's syndication fees, there's secondary trading fees, there's all kinds of ways. So that's how they make the bulk of their money. So what's happening is, and that's how non-Muslims are getting involved in this, because they're seeding the market. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are seeding the market and going to these banks and saying, find someone who will do a Sharia bond deal. And they went to GE because GE needs a lot of money. And GE said, yeah, we'll do it. And so then you have investors all over the world who know GE, who know the name, you know, and they're being said, you know, this is a little bit, it's kind of a different bond. It's a little more ethical. It has a little higher yield on it, by the way, interest. And, you know, if you're going to buy a regular Western GE bond, you might as well just buy the Islamic one and get a little extra interest in it. And that's how it's being sold. That's how money's being made.
Hello, my name is Chris Kasich, Family Research Council. I have two questions. One, are they originating these Islamic financial products in the United States, and are they subject then to SEC investigation and all that sort of thing? I'm also interested in, are they creating, let's say, dispute, like jihad-based mediation panels, or, you know, sort of quasi-judicial organs that are sort of outside the normal judicial process? I mean, because these are contracts. You could go and you can, you know, determine where your forum is going to be for settling the dispute and the law that's going to be in the dispute. I mean, you could say the law of the dispute resolution is going to be Sharia, I guess, right? Mm-hmm. Or I mean, how does all that sort of stuff work? I mean, because that seems to me to be another sort of angle on this, which is the kind of the institutionalization of this in our legal system. Anyway, that's
okay. So the first question is, are they originating this on our soil? Well, AIG is offering Sharia insurance to American investors, so yes, it's being originated here. And HSBC has 2 Sharia mutual funds, yes, to American investors, so yes, they are being originated here. And Dow Jones has an Islamic mutual fund also. And there's probably more that I just don't know about. Your answer about, you know, that issue of whether or not, at the end of the day, this investment falls under Sharia law or falls under U.S. law only comes into play when there's a default. Because then the creditors go, okay, so where do I fall into all this? Is this U.S. law or Sharia law? There hasn't been the defaults, and there's been a number of defaults. They've all happened over in Dubai. You know, Dubai recently had a meltdown, right? And a lot of those creditors are now starting to say, well, wait a minute. They're starting to see what's going on. They're starting to say, is this U.S.? Am I protected under U.S. law or English common law? Or is this all about Sharia law? And we don't know the answer to that yet because it's still unraveling. But you can bet that there are folks on the other side making this, you know, as you say, kind of moderating this, having these panels to kind of ease everybody's thoughts about this. And they'll come to something. I don't know. But, I mean, you'll never really, in the end of the day, Sharia law will reign. But they'll make it look like, you know, U.S. law is being acknowledged. So it's very dangerous. And that is another issue. Because there's country risk involved here. I mentioned AIG, and I'm just going to talk about a lawsuit. Anyone want to hear about the lawsuit? Because you might be saying, is anyone doing anything? Yes, they are doing something. When AIG took taxpayer bailout money, and a month later they went and they issued that press release, well, there was a Marine named Kevin Murray who said, wait a minute, you sent me over to Iraq 2 times to fight the Taliban. I come home and I find out that as a taxpayer, I own AIG, and it's offering Sharia insurance. So a lawsuit developed. It's now Kevin Murray against, it was Henry Paulson originally. Now it's in the hands of Tim Geithner. So it's Kevin Murray against our U.S. Treasury. And the basis of the suit is that our U.S. government is not allowed to engage in a religious-based business, according to the First Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. But what we're hoping is going to happen with this, that of course that's true. But what we're hoping to prove in discovery is that this is not a religion. Sharia is not a religion. You're engaging in a political business that's out to undermine the United States of America. And the good news is that it's in its 14th month. The Attorney General of the United States has done everything that he can to sideswipe this this lawsuit, there have been many motions to dismiss, no grounds for this, no grounds for this, and the judge has repeatedly said, no, there are grounds for this. And so what we're hoping is going to happen when we get to the point where we depose people like Taki Usmani and Kawadari, and we sit Citibank down and Goldman Sachs down and say, do you know the definition of charity? Do you know what zakat is? So that's the goal. Yeah.
Bonner Cohen, National Center for Public Policy Research, and I'm also writing a book on U.S. involvement in Afghanistan. You mentioned that one of the goals of Sharia finance is replacement of capitalism through Sharia finance. Have they reached the level of sophistication yet where they are engaged in currency manipulation with all the money that they have and all the resources that they dispose of? We normally think of that as being the domain of George Soros and George Soros wannabes. Have they branched out to that area yet?
It's very hard to say. I don't have the facts to support that. I know there's a lot of conjecture out there that they might, but if you just think about it this way, if you have a customer who becomes a very, very large customer in your bank, then when they say, you know what, we really don't want you to lend money for the construction of churches anymore. We really don't want you engaging in, funding certain films. Otherwise, we're going to pull our funds. You can see how much power there is there. It's just like with any business. You don't want to rely on one customer because then they get to make the rules. And that's how it's going to work. So what's going to happen is all these banks, okay, are creating mini Islamic or mini Iranian banks within their corporate structures, right? And they're growing. And what's going to happen, to put it into Wall Street terms, is you're either going to have a friendly merger or a hostile takeover. And that's what's going to happen. So I think we all need some nourishment, maybe a drink. Sure.
The Attorney General, the FBI, all these groups, certainly if these funds are going in a continuous flow to charities, some of which are going to criminal organizations, have they, to what degree have they looked at it? Do we have anybody in Congress, senators or congressmen that are looking into this, that are interested in this? What's happening?
I'd like to tell you that our government is investigating this. Certain congressmen, Sue Myrick, Senator Kyle, Congressman Wolf, have written letters to the SEC and the U.S. Treasury and saying we're very concerned about what's happening in Sharia finance. And they've gotten letters back saying, we've done our due diligence, and it's fine. And I can tell you that I went to see Steve Levy, number 3 at the U.S. Treasury, in the last administration, along with some other people. He's in charge of terror financing, U.S. Treasury. And he got very insulted and said, you know what? We are very good at what we do. And we understand terror financing. And you're talking about Sharia law and talking about terror financing. There's an awful lot of dots to connect here. He wouldn't read anything we showed him. I don't know why, but we're seeing that, unfortunately, we're seeing that in this government. This government is unwilling to look at this issue, unwilling. And if you can get us to Barney Frank or anybody else in this administration, we'll go. But we're having a very, very hard time breaking through. I mean, remember, there's a lot of money at stake here. We have relationships with Saudi Arabia, right, who's a key driver in this market. Somehow we have this idea that the Emirates are Western, so we're putting sanctions on Iran when the Emirates are passing everything through to when the Emirates pass everything through. It's tough.
You mentioned earlier that the regional banks you feel are protecting America. Are they conscious of this whole situation that you know of? Are there?
That's a good question. I don't know if they're conscious of this or not. I would imagine that they're getting phone calls, and there's, you can imagine how strategic this is. How many people are out there promoting this? I'm sure that they're getting knocks on their doors saying that you should offer this. And we are starting to see Sharia mortgages being offered in this country, and they have to be offered by a retail bank. And now you may be reading about that Barclays, who's very, very deeply entrenched in this, is looking to buy a U.S. retail bank chain. So you're going to start seeing it pop up at the regional level. That's where I am. I don't know if some of them know about it and are saying we're not doing it or not. I'd like to think that's happening. But let me just say something. Nobody knows this whole story. You see, the people who are knocking on their doors, who are wearing three-piece suits, who are educated at Harvard, okay, talk about this as, listen, we've got Muslims in this country, and they need to be able to invest. They need a mortgage, otherwise they can't own a home. They're not telling you the backstory of what's going on. They're not telling you who's driving this market. And political correctness says, well, they can't own their homes. Well, that's an American value. We want them to own their homes. But what did Muslims do before Sharia mortgages? They had regular mortgages. And they're only asking for Sharia mortgages because they're being told at the mosque, ask for Sharia everything. Everything. Okay. Thanks.